Negative thoughts are not enemies that arrive from the outside. They are voices born within the unseen rooms of the mind. They rise not to destroy us, but to be acknowledged. Every dark thought carries a message, and when ignored, it grows louder. When faced, it begins to lose its power. Most people attempt to silence negativity by force, but suppression only drives it deeper, where it works silently and relentlessly. The mind is not a battlefield where one part must annihilate another. It is a living system seeking balance. Negative thoughts often emerge when a part of us has been neglected, denied, or rejected. They appear in moments of stillness, self-doubt, or fear, demanding recognition. To kill a negative thought does not mean to erase it, but to strip it of its authority over your identity. Observe your thoughts without judgment. The moment you witness a negative thought as an observer rather than a participant, its grip weakens. You realize that you are not the thought. You are the awareness behind it. This separation is the beginning of freedom. What once felt like truth is revealed as habit, conditioning, or unresolved emotion. Negative thinking thrives in darkness. Bring it into consciousness, and it begins to transform. Ask yourself, why does this thought exist? What fear feeds it? What belief sustains it? When examined honestly, many negative thoughts collapse under their own weight. They were never facts, only stories repeated so often they felt real. Growth requires integration, not denial. The shadow within you is not evil, it is unexamined. When you accept the parts of yourself you once resisted, negative thoughts lose their need to dominate. They no longer need to scream to be heard. Awareness becomes the light that dissolves their illusion. When you stop fighting your inner darkness and begin understanding it, you reclaim your power. The mind becomes a tool instead of a prison. Negative thoughts fade not because you destroyed them, but because you outgrew the identity that needed them. In this awakening, you do not become someone new. You remember who you were before fear taught you to forget. Negative thoughts do not arise by accident, nor are they intruders attacking the mind without reason. They emerge from deeper layers of the psyche, carrying information that has not yet found a conscious voice. When they surface, they often feel disruptive, uncomfortable, or even destructive, which is why the instinctive response is to resist them. Yet resistance misunderstands their purpose. These thoughts are not enemies to be eliminated. They are messengers shaped by experiences, memories, fears, and unmet needs that reside beneath awareness. The unconscious communicates in symbols, emotions, and recurring mental patterns rather than clear language. Negative thoughts are one of its most direct forms of expression. They appear when something within us seeks attention, whether it is unresolved pain, a suppressed emotion, or a belief formed during moments of vulnerability. Ignoring these signals does not make them disappear. It forces them to repeat themselves in louder and more disruptive ways. What is denied internally often returns externally as anxiety, self-sabotage, or emotional exhaustion. Many negative thoughts are rooted in early experiences where the mind learned to protect itself. Doubt, fear, and self-criticism often began as survival mechanisms, helping the psyche navigate uncertainty or avoid danger. Over time, these protective patterns outlive their usefulness, yet they remain active because they were never consciously examined. When such thoughts arise, they are not trying to harm us, they are reenacting old strategies in a present moment that no longer requires them. Understanding this transforms hostility into curiosity. The moment a negative thought is observed rather than believed, a subtle shift occurs. Instead of identifying with it, awareness creates distance. This distance allows the thought to be seen as a product of inner history rather than a statement of truth. What once felt absolute begins to soften. The mind realizes that these thoughts are conditioned responses, not reflections of reality. In this recognition, their emotional charge weakens. Negative thoughts often reveal the gap between who we are and who we believe we must be. They arise when the inner self conflicts with external expectations or internalized standards. The unconscious uses negativity to signal misalignment. Rather than silencing the message, listening to it with honesty can reveal where life has drifted away from authenticity. The discomfort is not a flaw, it is guidance. When approached with awareness, negative thoughts become tools for self-knowledge. They point toward unintegrated aspects of the self that seek recognition and healing. By acknowledging their origin and meaning, the psyche no longer needs to express itself through mental conflict. The thought completes its purpose and naturally dissolves. True inner growth begins when negativity is no longer feared. By treating negative thoughts as signals rather than threats, the mind moves from internal war to internal dialogue. In that dialogue, understanding replaces resistance, and the unconscious gradually reveals not chaos, but wisdom waiting to be understood. Suppression may feel like control, but in reality it is avoidance disguised as strength. When a negative thought arises, the instinct to push it away often comes from fear, the fear that acknowledging it will give it power. Yet what is resisted does not disappear. It retreats into deeper layers of the mind, where it continues to operate unseen. Suppressed thoughts do not dissolve, they accumulate, gaining intensity and influence precisely because they are denied expression and understanding. The mind functions as a self-regulating system that seeks wholeness. When a thought is forcefully silenced, the psyche interprets this as rejection. In response, the suppressed content demands attention through repetition. This is why unwanted thoughts return with greater urgency, often at the most inconvenient moments. Suppression teaches the mind that certain experiences are acceptable, creating internal division. One part of the psyche becomes the enforcer, while another becomes the outlaw, and conflict becomes inevitable. Negativity thrives in this hidden state. Unacknowledged thoughts shape behavior indirectly, influencing decisions, emotional reactions, and self-perception without conscious consent. They emerge as irritability, self-sabotage, anxiety, or unexplained fatigue. Because they are not consciously examined, they are mistaken for external problems or personal flaws. The individual fights symptoms rather than causes, reinforcing the cycle of inner resistance. Awareness changes this dynamic entirely. To become aware of a negative thought is not to agree with it, but to see it clearly. Awareness removes the emotional fog that gives the thought its power. When a thought is witnessed without judgment, it is no longer fused with identity. The mind shifts from being inside the thought to observing it from a distance. This shift alone weakens the thought's authority. In awareness, curiosity replaces fear. Instead of asking how to eliminate the thought, the mind asks why it exists, what emotion is attached to it, what belief sustains it, what past experience shaped it. These questions bring unconscious material into the light of understanding. Once illuminated, the thought no longer needs to shout for attention. Its intensity fades because its message has been received. Awareness also restores balance by allowing integration rather than rejection. When negative thoughts are acknowledged, the psyche no longer feels fragmented. The inner system relaxes, knowing it does not need to defend itself through repetition or emotional charge. What once appeared threatening is revealed as incomplete information seeking completion. Over time, awareness builds psychological resilience. Instead of reacting automatically, the individual responds consciously. Negative thoughts lose their grip not through force, but through familiarity and understanding. They are recognized as passing mental events rather than defining truths. In this state, suppression becomes unnecessary because awareness has already done what force never could. It has transformed conflict into clarity and resistance into understanding. Most people live as though every thought that passes through the mind is a declaration of truth and identity. A thought appears and instantly it is believed, defended, or feared. In this unconscious fusion, the mind becomes both the storyteller and the listener, leaving no space for perspective. Yet the most transformative realization a human being can have is this: thoughts arise, but something deeper witnesses their arrival and departure. That witness is not a thought itself, and it is not bound by the content it observes. Thoughts are transient phenomena. They emerge, change shape, contradict one another, and disappear, often without any conscious intention. If identity were truly defined by thought, the self would be unstable, constantly shifting with every passing idea. The fact that a sense of continuity remains despite the chaos of mental activity points to something more enduring than thought. There is an awareness that remains present regardless of what the mind produces. This awareness is not loud, dramatic, or forceful. It simply watches. The observer does not argue with thoughts, nor does it try to control them. It sees fear arise without becoming afraid, sees doubt appear without collapsing into uncertainty. When awareness is present, thoughts lose their power to dictate reality. They become objects of perception rather than commands to obey. This separation is subtle, yet it changes everything. What once felt overwhelming becomes manageable the moment it is seen rather than inhabited. Identifying with thoughts traps the individual in repetition. Old narratives replay themselves, reinforced by emotional reactions that feel automatic and inevitable. The observer breaks this loop by noticing a thought as it arises, without judgment or resistance. The mind creates space. In that space, choice becomes possible. One can decide whether a thought deserves attention or whether it is simply a conditioned echo from the past. The observer behind thought is not passive. It is deeply alive. It is the same awareness that notices emotions, sensations, and the passing of time. When this awareness is forgotten, the mind dominates experience. When it is remembered, the mind becomes a tool rather than a master. Thoughts continue to arise, but they no longer define the self. They are seen as mental events, not personal truths. This recognition does not eliminate thinking, nor does it require withdrawal from life. Instead, it brings clarity into engagement. Actions are no longer driven by unconscious narratives, but guided by conscious presence. The observer allows the individual to respond rather than react, to understand rather than assume. Freedom is not found in controlling thoughts, but in disidentifying from them. When you realize you are the awareness in which thoughts appear, inner chaos loses its authority. The mind becomes quieter, not because it is forced into silence, but because it is no longer believed unquestioningly. In this realization, identity shifts from fragile mental content to stable presence, and the self is no longer imprisoned by its own thinking. False beliefs rarely announce themselves as false. They settle quietly into the mind, often formed during moments of emotional intensity, vulnerability, or repeated experience. Over time, they harden into assumptions about the self, others, and the world. Because they operate beneath conscious awareness, they shape perception and behavior without being questioned. What feels like reality is often only interpretation reinforced through habit and repetition rather than truth. Conscious examination begins with the willingness to pause. In that pause, the automatic flow of thinking is interrupted, and a belief is brought into awareness. This act alone is powerful. A belief that has never been questioned depends on invisibility to survive. Once it is seen clearly, it loses the unquestioned authority it once held. Awareness creates a distance between the observer and the belief, transforming it from an identity-defining truth into a mental construct open to inquiry. When a belief is consciously examined, its origins often reveal themselves. Many false beliefs are inherited rather than chosen, absorbed from family, culture, or early experiences. Others arise as protective conclusions drawn in moments of fear or pain. At the time, they may have served a purpose, offering certainty or safety. But when carried into new circumstances without re-evaluation, they distort perception. Conscious examination allows the mind to recognize that a belief formed in the past may no longer be relevant in the present. Questioning a belief does not require aggression or denial. It requires curiosity, asking simple, honest questions such as why the belief exists when it first appeared, and what evidence supports it begins to loosen its grip. Often, the evidence is emotional rather than factual. The belief persists not because it is true, but because it feels familiar. Familiarity is mistaken for truth when awareness is absent. As examination deepens, contradictions emerge. The mind begins to notice experiences that do not align with the belief. These contradictions were always present, but they were filtered out to preserve mental consistency. Awareness reopens perception. The belief, once rigid, becomes porous. It can no longer contain the full complexity of lived experience, and its certainty begins to erode. This process does not destroy the mind's structure, it refines it. Conscious examination replaces unconscious belief with understanding. The psyche becomes more flexible, more responsive to reality as it is rather than as it was once interpreted. False beliefs dissolve not through force but through clarity. They cannot survive sustained attention because they depend on assumption rather than truth. As beliefs dissolve, mental energy is freed. The mind no longer expends effort defending outdated narratives. What remains is a clearer perception of self and world, unburdened by inherited or unexamined conclusions. In this clarity, understanding replaces assumption, and reality is experienced directly rather than through the distortion of false belief. Inner imbalance often arises not from what is present within the psyche, but from what has been rejected, denied, or pushed out of awareness. Every individual carries aspects of themselves that were once judged unacceptable, inconvenient, or threatening to their self-image. These disowned parts do not vanish. They retreat into the unconscious, forming what can be described as the shadow. Though unseen, the shadow continuously influences behavior, emotions, and perceptions, creating tension within the inner world. The shadow is not composed of darkness alone. It contains instincts, emotions, desires, and traits that were suppressed to gain approval, maintain control, or avoid pain. Anger may have been buried to appear agreeable, vulnerability hidden to appear strong, ambition restrained to avoid conflict. Each act of suppression fragments the psyche, creating an internal division where one part strives for order while another seeks expression. This division is the source of inner unrest. Integration begins with recognition. When shadow aspects are acknowledged rather than condemned, their energy shifts. What was once disruptive becomes informative. Awareness reveals that these hidden parts exist not to sabotage life, but to restore wholeness. They represent qualities that were excluded, not because they were harmful, but because they were misunderstood or feared. By bringing them into consciousness, the psyche begins to heal its internal split. Without integration, the shadow expresses itself indirectly. It appears in projections, where unwanted traits are seen in others rather than recognized within. It surfaces in compulsive behaviors, emotional overreactions, and self-sabotage. These expressions are not failures of character, they are attempts by the unconscious to be acknowledged. When the shadow is met with understanding, it no longer needs to act out. Integration does not mean indulging every impulse or acting out suppressed emotions without restraint. It means understanding their origin, purpose, and appropriate expression. Anger, once integrated, becomes assertiveness. Fear becomes discernment. Desire becomes creativity. The energy locked in repression is transformed into constructive force when consciously recognized. As integration progresses, inner balance naturally emerges. The psyche no longer wastes energy maintaining rigid self-images or internal defenses. There is less inner conflict because fewer parts of the self are at war. Acceptance replaces resistance, and the individual experiences a deeper sense of coherence. Choices become more authentic because they arise from a whole self rather than a fragmented one. True balance is not the absence of tension, but the harmony of opposites. When light and shadow are allowed to coexist within awareness, the individual becomes grounded and resilient. Inner peace arises not from perfection, but from completeness. By integrating the shadow, the psyche regains equilibrium, and the individual stands centered, no longer divided against themselves. Negative thoughts persist not because they are powerful, but because they are rooted in an outdated sense of identity. The mind clings to familiar narratives about who one is, what is possible, and what must be feared. These narratives form a psychological framework that shapes perception. As long as identity remains unchanged, the same thoughts will continue to arise, repeating patterns that once felt necessary. Growth begins when identity itself starts to shift. True growth is not the act of fighting negative thoughts, but the process of becoming someone who no longer needs them. Many negative thoughts originate from a self-image built around limitation, protection, or past pain. They once served a purpose, warning against danger or preventing disappointment. However, when life expands and awareness deepens, these mental habits become misaligned with present reality. They linger not because they are true, but because identity has not yet caught up with experience. As growth unfolds, perspective widens. The individual begins to see themselves not as a fixed character, but as a dynamic process. This realization weakens the emotional charge behind negativity. Thoughts that once felt threatening lose relevance because they no longer match the current self. Fear-based narratives struggle to survive in an identity grounded in awareness, self-trust, and adaptability. Growth also brings increased responsibility for inner life. Rather than blaming circumstances or resisting thoughts, the individual recognizes their role in shaping meaning. This shift in responsibility transforms identity from victim to participant. Negative thoughts lose their authority when they are no longer reinforced by unconscious identification. They appear, but they no longer define action or self-worth. With growth comes integration. Past experiences are no longer denied or idealized, they are understood. The emotional weight attached to old memories lightens as insight replaces reaction. Negative thoughts, which once drew energy from unresolved conflict, begin to fade because the conflict itself has been resolved. The mind no longer needs to repeat lessons that have already been learned. Identity transformation is subtle but profound. It is marked not by dramatic mental silence, but by a change in what feels believable. The individual no longer resonates with thoughts rooted in fear, inadequacy, or self-rejection. These thoughts feel foreign, like echoes from a former life. Without resonance, they dissolve naturally, lacking the emotional energy required to persist. Growth does not erase the capacity for negative thought, it renders it unnecessary. The mind becomes oriented toward understanding rather than defense, curiosity rather than fear. In this state, negativity cannot take root because the psychological soil has changed. By transforming identity, growth reshapes the inner landscape, and negative thoughts fade not through effort, but through irrelevance. And so the work is not to silence the mind, but to understand it. Not to destroy what feels dark, but to bring it into awareness where it can no longer rule unseen. When you observe your thoughts, examine your beliefs, integrate what you once rejected, and allow growth to reshape who you are, negativity loses its foundation. What remains is not perfection, but balance, not constant positivity, but clarity. In this clarity, the mind becomes a servant rather than a master, and you move forward no longer ruled by old patterns, but guided by conscious presence and inner wholeness.